Hi, Noam. How are you?
Good, Brink. How are you?
I'm good. For our viewers out there, I'm Brink Lindsey from the Cato Institute, and
I'm Noam Scheiber with the New Republic.
Very good. This is your first foray into the Blogging Heads world?
That's right. It's my maiden Blogging Heads voyage.
So. Well, I'll try to be gentle.
Thank you.
Well, we're in the middle of the political season. We had a big contest last night, the Florida primary. Big winner, John McCain. We now have a clear field. It's been winnowed down to McCain and Mitt Romney. With McCain, I think, having the inside track now. Do you want to start off with horse race handicapping and what what Florida meant for McCain and where Romney stands, and does he have any hope to turn this thing around?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my sort of quickie take was, after Michigan and even leading up to the Florida vote, there was this sort of rediscovery of Romney, almost a Romney renaissance, this feeling that, wow, he had spent all these months running as this sort of transparently phony social conservative,
right,
and that clearly didn't work. And here was this guy, he now found his voice. He was kind of a pragmatic, technocratic businessman guy who could just solve problems kind of non-ideologically. And that was kind of the storyline, again, coming out of Michigan, seemed to be keeping him close in Florida. I think what we saw last night was that really didn't work.
Right.
The Romney campaign may have had it right all along. If you look at Florida, his base really was conservatives and affluent people. And he really didn't speak much to kind of middle-class people concerned about the economy. McCain won those people pretty handily after Romney had won.
Does the conservatives group have a socioeconomic profile, or do they run up and down the income and education spectrum?
I think we could discern that if we were willing to pay for more sophisticated exit poll data. Unfortunately, the exit poll data that's made publicly available, it kind of segregates income and education from ideology, which is annoying.
Yeah.
But if you look, if you kind of trace out the contours of what we could trace out with the data that was available, you see, basically Romney won upper middle class people, affluent people, 100 to 200,000. Those were Romney people. Below 100,000, they were kind of tied for a while, between 75 and 100, and then below that, McCain wins handily. Whereas in Michigan, Romney won across all socioeconomic groups. McCain wins people who think the economy is poor and who think it's not good. So the two people who don't think the two groups who don't think it's good, McCain won.
Yeah.
Romney really kind of did claim a sort of narrow slice of the demographic spectrum, which was very conservative people. Even people who consider themselves somewhat conservative were kind of split, McCain, Romney, and everyone else, to the left on the political spectrum was for McCain, and
right.
Then those upper middle class people. And I think it's kind of a ghetto. It's no longer, you can't win just country club Republicans and conservatives. That ideologically those two groups used to be different.
Right.
Now it's a sort of narrower demographic slice, and he's really just winning very conservative voters, not even somewhat conservative voters. So
these are pro-Bush conservative voters, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
So that's if your main source of support is people who think George Bush is doing a good job, that doesn't seem like a path to a majority.
It's not a base that you can kind of stand on. That's right. So I think the Romney people probably had the race gamed out correctly. They probably needed to. He just wasn't a guy that sort of middle class people can relate to, I think, and that kind of showed. McCain had a much better connection with those people, and with the exception of Michigan, I think you've seen that in a lot of the exit poll data. Romney just doesn't reach those people.
So McCain isn't really known for any kind of I feel your pain empathy or anything like that. He's really wooden and stilted when he tries to do stuff like that. It's just that he has an appealing personality and Romney doesn't. Is that?
I think that's right. I think this may actually be an incredibly superficial, and I'm sure you'll be shocked to know that the voting public often, or at least sometimes bases its decisions on superficial characterological traits. But this may be one of those. I think you're right. He's not a he's not connecting on a kind of Bill Clinton, I feel your pain, emotion. It's really just he seems like a good guy. He's a little sort of subversive. He seems candid and kind of magnetic, and people are drawn to him for that, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
So now it's basically a week to go for Romney to be able to turn around his fortunes, right? And so he's got to make this big last stand on Super Tuesday. What does he do? What does he do between now and then? And then tell me, we're going to have Rudy Giuliani dropping out today and endorsing McCain. What does that matter? I take it Huckabee will stay in, and what does that matter?
Well, I think as to the first question, I think Romney's only ray of hope. It's sort of twofold. One, it sort of continued conservative and establishment Republican suspicion of John McCain. I was just listening to a conservative talk radio show on the way over here, and Paul Weyrich, the longtime conservative poobah, was just wringing his hands palpably about whether he could support McCain. It didn't sound like he could, so I think there's still a lot of conservative establishment suspicion of John McCain, and Mitt Romney will definitely be the beneficiary of it. As a practical matter, I don't know how much it matters other than in money. McCain, even having won a handful of primaries now, just doesn't have a lot of cash. Romney obviously has his own checkbook. If Romney can keep the sort of establishment people on the sidelines for another week while dipping into his bank account, on MSNBC last night, Howard Fineman said that he'd heard Romney officials say they could spend $20 to $30 million more on Super Tuesday. Money talks, and if McCain doesn't have it and Romney does, again, this is on the assumption that the establishment people, the money men, the conservatives who are still skeptical of McCain, sit on the sidelines. Maybe he has a fighting chance.
Didn't Romney massively outspend McCain in Florida? Or massively outbuy him on TV commercials? On
TV, yes. It was almost an order of magnitude. That's right.
So that didn't help much.
It's not clear that obviously the money has some effect. It's not clear that it's going to be able to turn the tide on a massive sort of scale that he'd need to do it on Super Tuesday. Particularly, the momentum that McCain has now, combined with the leads that he was starting to see in big states like California and New York, with Rudy Giuliani's endorsement. You mentioned Giuliani, can only help in a place like New York, New Jersey. Even in California, Giuliani had some organization and some support. The path to victory for Romney is really tricky. I think he's just got to hope that a lot of these skeptical conservative talk radio hosts rough him up, and the money men don't decide that the fix is in for McCain.
Yeah, I mean the obvious inference is that that Giuliani dropping out and giving his endorsement to McCain further bolsters McCain's chances, while Huckabee staying in and appealing to social conservatives and evangelicals cuts away from the base that Romney would otherwise want to be building. But I saw one thing, at least, that cuts against that, which is, I guess, according to the Florida exit polls, the second choice of Giuliani voters was Romney by a nose, and the second choice of Huckabee voters was McCain by a lot, and which struck me as totally unanticipated. And I don't know then if it works out quite the way I would have thought, that Giuliani dropping out and Huckabee staying in is necessarily a complete tilting of the field in favor of McCain.
You're right. I saw that too, and it was a little goofy. The only sort of quickie explanation I had was McCain and Romney probably appealed to a certain type of person in Florida, a northeastern transplant maybe, so there was maybe a similar sensibility on the various demographics that they were appealing to. On the McCain-Huckabee side, I think you have to look a little at what evangelicals did last night. The last exit poll result I saw, and the exit polls, for those who don't follow this as closely, the exit polls continue to get updated over the course of the night as they match actual results with exit poll numbers. So, if I looked at it at 10 o'clock, it's possible that at midnight it could have been tweaked slightly. But the last one I saw was fairly late in the evening. It showed McCain at 28% among white evangelicals, Romney at 31%, and Huckabee at 31%. And my sense is that a lot of those Huckabee people, they're the most conservative, religiously conservative evangelicals, probably the people most likely to be suspicious of a Mormon.
Yes.
And so their second choice, you might see them tilt toward McCain because they're the kind of subset of evangelicals who, for religious reasons, might not feel comfortable with Romney.
That's possible. All right, so what does all this mean? We're down now to McCain and Romney, and I think the narrative of the crack up of conservatism continues to hold up pretty well. It's been it's the agonies of conservatism with the failures of Bush and then the repudiation of the elections of '06. That's been an ongoing story, and then with the failure of any of the Republican candidates to kind of reunite all the major elements of the Reagan coalition. I think now we see that quite starkly. It seems like McCain and Romney, at least in terms of their messaging, split the Reagan coalition right down the middle. So you've got the proverbial three legs of the stool: national security, social conservatives, economic conservatives. McCain clearly appealing to national security conservatives with war. Romney clearly appealing to social conservatism with his immigrant baiting. And then they split the economic conservatives down the middle. McCain is the budget hawk, and Romney is more the kind of supply side or growth type. Whoever wins, there's another way they split it too, is that you've got McCain is sort of a genuine, authentic guy who's kind of a half conservative, whereas Romney is a transparent phony pretending to be a full-blooded conservative.
Right.
So you've got the real. You've got the choice between a real half loaf and the appearance of a full loaf. And,
right, exactly.
And whoever wins, well, certainly if McCain wins, then there's going to be a whole bunch of disgruntled movement conservative, red state-based types, and I don't know what that means going forward. The thing, well, you tell me. What does all of this talk of the coalition matter that much, or is it? McCain's going to run. He's going to be up against a candidate that has its vulnerabilities, and does this conservatism's crack up thing, is that overblown, or do you think it's a real thing?
Right. I would say two things. One, I don't think we can dismiss sort of random luck and circumstance as an explanation here. I mean, I totally agree with you. Bush has certainly helped fracture the conservative base. There's no question about that. There's considerable amount of hostility toward Bush that kind of bubbles up as support for a guy like John McCain, who, throughout the 7+ years of the Bush era, has at various points been a finger in his eye. So there's no question that the base is sort of fractured, and you certainly saw that play out in the primaries. On the other hand, I think, if a George Allen type had gotten in the race, or even if Fred Thompson had been a more plausible candidate, or if Bill Frist had been a more plausible candidate, you might have seen a guy step in and kind of unite all three legs of the stool, like Romney would say, authentically, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I think there are sort of plausible reasons for what we're seeing, but I think it's entirely possible that we wouldn't be having this conversation had just a more plausible sort of fusionist candidate entered the race. So there is a bit of circumstance at play here too.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if you see something that's if you see a company whose fundamentals are bad and you short the stock, you could still end up losing your shirt because it may take a long time for those fundamentals to really play out.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. That's right. Right.
And in this case, I do think the fundamentals for the Goldwater to Reagan movement, conservative movement, I think the fundamentals of that movement are played out. Conservatism came to power because of three major things: concern about the Soviets, concern about kind of law and order and just sort of social chaos and social breakdown, and stagflation and economic underperformance. So on the economic front, we've had 20-something years of macroeconomic good news of growth with low inflation and just 18 months of recession in a quarter of a century. And so continuing that doesn't get you any credit, as George Bush has discovered. Soviets are gone, and crime is way down. It's from where it was in its peak in the early 90s. It's maybe come back up a little bit in the last year or so, but still way down from where it was at the peak. And the kind of Democratic Party's perceived closeness with out of the mainstream kind of wacko, loony left interest groups and ideological enthusiasms, that's all been tamped down a lot. And so conservatism kind of won. It accomplished its objectives, and it's not really been able to figure out what to do next. And I'm afraid all that it's really come up with is trying to scare the hell out of people. And we see that with, as I said, that at least on paper, McCain and Romney split the coalition in two, but both of them are running on xenophobia, fear. Fear of that foreigners pose an existential threat to the country. In Romney's case, it's those Mexican illegal immigrants, and in McCain's case, it's the international jihad that we have to fight for 100 years. So, not that there isn't a real problem with our immigration situation, not that that terrorism isn't a serious and the most serious national security problem, but the way they approach these issues is in a way calculated to stoke fear, which seems to me that's where you end up when you don't really have any positive vision of where you want to push the country, and so it feels like intellectual bankruptcy to me.
Well, I largely agree with your historical narrative. The one thing I would emphasize is the role that fear played, throughout the conservative ascendance.
Yes.
Certainly fear of, these existential threats, nuclear annihilation, but also just fear, I think a sort of basic fear. I mean, crime, I think it was very tied up with race. And Republicans, particularly in the South, Lee Atwater and Reagan, were very deft at sort of playing the race card and playing on white fears of black, young black men, basically. And Bill Clinton, to his credit, probably did a lot to help take that off the table for Democrats.
Absolutely. And sometimes, it's smart to be fearful, right? That's
right. Well, that may be. Yeah.
And that's, that's to me the big difference is that the threats, the fear of which energized conservatives long ago, the threats were real. We really did have an explosion of crime from 65 to 92. We really did have, a globe-straddling empire with 10,000 nuclear warheads aimed at us. Whereas, to me, the cultural threat posed by Mexican immigrants and the existential threat posed by terrorists strike me as manufactured and overblown.
Yeah, I guess I'm somewhat sympathetic to that. I think people could argue that, reasonable people could disagree about the size of the threat that we face now and how much of it is sort of manufactured as a tactic and how much of it is actually real. This gets into a discussion that we may want to have later on with respect to Huckabee and Edwards, but I think, a lot of what you're seeing is some sort of structural rejiggering on the right, and there are various constraints on it, and that cause it to sort of create tension now, and it's not clear where it's going. And by which I mean, basically the GOP over the last generation, but certainly under George Bush and in the beginning, I guess in the late '80s, through the George W. Bush era, has really attracted a lot of working class votes, and they tend to be sort of social conservatives. They tend to be very religious. They're sympathetic to government spending on some level. They're skeptical of business on some level. and it's still a party that's largely funded by corporate class and by supply-siders and people who are interested in tax cuts. And so I think that part of what you're seeing is just sort of a fundamental contradiction in what the Republican Party is. Now it sort of relies heavily on the votes of people who are not particularly affluent and not particularly interested in upper-income tax cuts or sort of supply-side tax cuts. On the other hand, that's where the money comes from in the Republican Party. So it's sort of tough to see how you get away from that. And to me, part of the sort of bankruptcy or part of the stagnation of the party is it just sort of hasn't sorted out or hasn't really reconciled this contradiction between where the votes are coming from and where the money is coming from.
Yeah, and that contradiction, I think, has been heightened by conservative successes. So during the Reagan Democrats came on board the Republican economic program when stagflation and inflation's bracket creep pushed up their tax burdens a lot. So you had across the board big increases in the tax bite, and that through successive waves of tax policy changes is that's no longer a problem. A lot of the Republican base now isn't really feeling overtaxed, and so the recipients of further tax cuts get as a narrower and narrower group of people.
That's right. No, I think that's exactly right. Initially, sort of frustration with tax policy and government's tentacles may have brought that first wave of Reagan Democrats to the Republican Party, but over the last 20 years, particularly over the last 10, it's more social conservatism I think that's brought them there. Yeah.
Well, let's switch over to the Democrats. We've got we're down to two. Officially, I guess John Edwards is dropping out today as well. Is he endorsing anybody or?
This could make me look ignorant by the time this runs, but since I suspect there's a decent chance that he will. As of now, I had not heard that he was planning on endorsing anybody. I had heard that he'd placed a phone call to Hillary, that no one knew yet whether he had talked to Obama. On the other hand, the rumor, sort of the open secret among journalists who cover the campaign is that he and Obama are relatively friendly, and he really doesn't like Hillary very much. So make of that what you will. But I guess the big question is, where would the Edwards voters go, independent of whom Edwards endorsed?
Yes.
And I guess you could see that argument, really going two ways. I mean, the one argument is, well, Edwards' message was really targeted. He had a populist message targeted at working class people. Hillary tends to do better among those people, downscale whites, so you could see a natural affinity there. On the other hand, the Edwards people will tell you, and he certainly made the case often during the campaign, that this guy was running a campaign about change and fundamentally reforming Washington, and she's the Washington insider, and the change people clearly aren't going to Hillary. They'll probably go with Obama. So I think we're basically, you can see this sort of principled arguments on both sides. It's kind of an empirical question at this point, I guess.
Yeah. So if he really is, closer with Obama and is attempting, whether he will eventually explicitly do so or not, to lean in Obama's direction, it's not clear to me that his getting out of the race is an obvious boost for Obama's prospects in Super Tuesday states, but you would know that much better than I do.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, particularly, there are several southern states that vote on Super Tuesday: Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Arkansas. Arkansas, Hillary is probably going to win just by virtue of familiarity, though maybe the familiarity has bred some contempt over the years. I don't know. But Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, those are states that Obama, I think, is really hoping to win. And if I'm Obama, maybe I want John Edwards in those states, siphoning off white voters that may otherwise go to Hillary. I mean, we saw in South Carolina that it didn't matter. I mean, even the combined votes of Edwards and Hillary would not have beaten Barack Obama.
Right.
But clearly, Obama would rather those delegates go to John Edwards than to Hillary, even if he carries a state. So I think you're right. I think it's not at all clear that this is what the Obama people want. And, even if Edwards does like Obama and wants to help him, there's an argument to be made that the best way to do that would be to continue to accumulate delegates and then give them, gift wrap them and give them to Obama in one fell swoop at the convention if it comes down to it.
So what's the handicapping of the horse race look like going into Super Tuesday? I feel like even with Obama's big South Carolina triumph, and the follow-up of the Kennedy endorsement, that still Hillary has some pretty big built-in advantages, and she's going to be tough to beat.
I think that's right. I mean, the Obama strategy, I guess, is a plausible one. It's a perfectly plausible path to the, at least to staying in the race and making it a very close race, is do well in those southern states that I named. Then there are sort of 5 or 6 caucus states which traditionally favor the candidate who's very well organized because they're sort of low turnout propositions. The Obama campaign has been organizing very aggressively in those states. Some of them are actually big states like Minnesota and Colorado, Kansas to a lesser extent. So he could pick up some delegates there if he does well there, and they've definitely organized themselves very well there. Recent poll had him slightly up in Colorado. So between the southern states and those caucus states and Illinois, obviously, he'll get a significant number of victories, hopefully. That's the thinking on their part. And then, the idea is just to pick up a lot of delegates, even in states that he loses, since none of these, unlike the Republican side, or many of them, unlike the Republican side, are not winner-take-all. So in California, basically the delegates, as far as I understand, get allocated by congressional district.
Right.
He could win a lot of congressional districts in California, even if he loses overall. Same with New York. There are a lot of, heavily African-American congressional districts that he could do very well in. So I think the strategy is twofold. Win a certain volume of states, just so you can point to a number of states. We won 6 or 8 or 10 states, even if we didn't win, a majority of the 22 states. And in the other states, we won almost as many delegates as Hillary did.
Yeah.
I think that's their hope at this point.
So, and then going forward, it's just a slog.
Yeah, I think so. The conventional wisdom has always been that a slog favors Hillary because she's got all these institutional advantages. She's got the name recognition, the familiarity with voters. Bill, if Obama doesn't come and knock her off,
right.
It's tough to see how she loses the nomination. I think that's clearly still true to a certain extent. And but the counter argument, which I think is becoming more and more relevant now, and this relates to something we mentioned at the beginning, which is the sort of inside the Beltway establishment types kind of fleeing the Hillary camp.
Yep.
The counter argument is, how does Hillary and Bill in particular wear?
Yes.
And is it the case that if Obama can just fight these guys to a standstill for a month, they're not going to wear well? People are just going to remember all the things that they were exasperated by in the 90s. They're going to start to remember that these guys are sort of can be cynical and manipulative and will say anything to get elected. And this is these are the frames that Obama is trying to get out there. And if over the course of a month, the various manipulating, even just last night with the Florida primary on the Democratic side, which really didn't count for any delegates, and the candidates had agreed not to campaign there. The Obama campaign is trying to say, well, the Hillary people agreed to the same rules everyone else did, but now that she did well there, she's trying to change the rules ex post.
Right.
Again, this sort of trying to get out there that they will do anything to get elected. If they can sort of succeed in reminding people of all the things the Clintons did in the 90s to make them feel queasy, then maybe a sort of long slog actually begins to favor Obama at a certain point.
Let's talk about this wave of revulsion that you've seen from Beltway Democrats and liberals against the Clintons in the last week or so. But first, just one horse race question, and that is, Florida, did it mean anything for the Democrats? It seems like nobody campaigned there, and yet Hillary won big, and that's got to be a good sign for her.
Yeah, I think it's a good sign. I think it tells us a lot of what we already knew, which is that when Obama campaigns in a place and has an organization in the place, he does pretty well, and when it's strictly sort of a function of what people knew prior to any sort of effort by the campaigns, that that she does very well. The Hillary people would argue, not without justification, that, well, on Super Tuesday there are 22 states and Obama can't possibly be campaigning in all of those states, and kind of give people a personal touch the way he did in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. There's an element of truth to that. On the other hand, he's going to be running a lot of commercials, which really wasn't the case in Florida. Some of them will have people like Ted Kennedy vouching for him who have a lot of credibility among working class voters, Latinos, senior citizens, places where he's weak, basically. And, he's got a great organization in a lot of these places, and there was no organization to speak of in Florida. And really, particularly in a place, say, even like California, they're trying to do something unprecedented. They have, 5 to 10,000 precinct captains in California. They actually think they can sort of organize their way to a competitive race in California. It's never really been done, but just the sheer energy that the campaign has inspired among young people and people who hadn't been involved before allows them to do some things that just have never been done before.
Yeah.
And so I just don't think you can say, even in a state like California, that the energy and the organization won't benefit him somewhat. On top of which, independents in California can only vote on the Democratic side. The Republican primary is closed in California. Democratic side is open to independents. Obama does very well among independents. So the combination of those things and the organization, maybe he makes California pretty close.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move then to the Clintons. They've been generating energy of their own in the last week or so,
Absolutely,
which is negative energy. Tell me about this kind of spasm of disgust that we've seen from the Beltway Democratic establishment and liberal commentariat.
Well, I wrote a little bit about this in my piece for this latest issue of the New Republic, and the way I came into it was actually before Ted Kennedy had endorsed, but John Kerry had endorsed not long before, and so I came at it through sort of John Kerry's eyes and actually Tom Daschle's eyes too, who had endorsed long ago, but had become very active in the Obama campaign. A lot of Daschle's former staffers are very high up in the Obama campaign. In the sense I got from the Kerry and the Obama and the Daschle people were just, on some level, sort of a vague Clinton fatigue. On some level, just still not completely over some of the slights and grievances of the 90s. I quote a former Tom Daschle staffer who remembered, they had worked very hard on some legislation in 1996, which was sort of important to Bill Clinton's re-election effort, and the White House had stayed completely removed from that effort. They kind of said, you guys, you're going to have to handle this yourselves. So Daschle worked very hard to ram this stuff through the Senate, and worked with some Republicans to do that. Then at the last minute, the White House kind of swooped in, claimed credit. They had this sort of big Rose Garden signing ceremony. The Daschle people show up at the White House, and they're not even on the guest list. And who should be sitting there when they walk in? They finally get in after frantically making all these phone calls. Is all these Republican committee chairmen and their staffs. So these things sort of irked, and it sounds like a sort of petty complaint. But if you're someone who was a top lieutenant to Tom Daschle, and you went through this time and again, and your boss subsequently loses in 2004 because he's taken all these tough votes for the sake of party unity, while Bill Clinton was off sort of triangulating and kind of being with Democrats when it helped, say on impeachment, but doing his own thing when it didn't. There are these residual frustrations, and I think the thinking was, okay, we had to put up with this stuff in the 90s. The guy was the president. We were the people in Congress. It was every reason in the world we had to do this. And Daschle was personally somewhat friendly with the Clintons. There's no question about that. But do we have to still put up with it 8 years later?
Yeah.
Even after Clinton left the White House, you had Terry McAuliffe as DNC chairman through early 2005. You had the Center for American Progress, which was sort of a center for sort of Clintonites in waiting, a government in exile kind of situation. You had Harold Ickes, a top Clintonite, running these Soros-funded soft money institutions in the 2004 campaign. You get the sense at a certain point they just felt like enough. These people have been been around long enough. We didn't always see eye to eye when they were around, but it was fine because that was their moment. But now it's not their moment, and maybe it's just time to move on. And I think that's sort of part of what you're seeing with these people. Kerry had similar experiences in the 2004 campaign where the Clintons worked very hard for him, but at various moments when it sort of was a choice between promoting John Kerry and promoting the Clinton legacy, the Kerry people felt like Clinton always would sort of promote the Clinton legacy rather than John Kerry. There's one story, that they still get very bitter about, which is Clinton and John Kerry had this 90-minute phone conversation not long after the GOP convention in 2004. Kerry assumed it was completely confidential, off the record, just them talking, man to man, politician to politician. 36 hours later, it's on the front page of the New York Times,
right.
and it makes Bill Clinton look like this sage, and John Kerry looked like this sort of rudderless weakling,
right.
And it didn't take too much thinking to figure out who had leaked the story to the New York Times. So there's some residual frustration, some of it petty, some of it not, and I think that's an element of what you're saying.
No, so, I mean, of course, his whole strategy was one of triangulation, which means triangulating away from your home team. And there's always been a sense that that in any choice between what's good for the Clintons and what's good for anybody else, it's going to be the Clintons that win.
That's right.
And certainly, just in terms of bottom line results, that was absolutely the case during the 90s. Bill Clinton's the first two-term Democratic president in many decades. But at the same time, Democratic control of Congress was lost for the first time in decades. You had a real downward spiral in terms of governorships and control of state legislatures, so that by the end of the 90s, the Democrats had really been routed everywhere, except they hung on to the White House through thick and through thin, with a lot of loyalist support for Clinton when he was making it difficult for them to be loyal to him. So I certainly understand the kind of volcanic resentment that would be building up against this guy. It's just what triggered it last week. Why were so many people willing to play ball with Hillary in this campaign, given all of those memories and grievances of the past? Was it simply that when Bill leapt to the front of the stage after Iowa, and particularly after New Hampshire, that it became much more about the 90s than it was about Hillary and her distinctive vision of the future?
I think that was an element. Bill began to play a much more prominent role, particularly in New Hampshire. I think that basically two things happened. One, people saw that Obama had a real shot after he won Iowa, and certainly going into New Hampshire. And two, Bill, sort of became much more vocal, much more essential part of the presidential narrative that just kind of made people sort of queasy all over again. So the combination of the sense that this Obama guy really could win, that you wouldn't be wasting your time by needlessly alienating, the presumptive, second Clinton administration,
right?
And all of the sort of things that Bill did to irk post Iowa, I think really sort of welled up in some of those endorsements that you saw. Yeah.
So we've got the potential of a slog that goes all the way up to the convention. It's been quite bitter of late. There's noises being made that to make things less rancorous and toxic, but I'll believe that when I see it. Right. So we have the possibility of a good humdinger of just a bloodletting between these two. But what's the difference between them? What's at stake here? In terms of policy positions, not much. In terms of style, a lot. And there's been a couple of good pieces on that just recently. There was something in New York Magazine by John Heilerman about these very different kind of political visions. And John Chait in the New Republic just had some, or actually it was in the LA Times, I think, his column, very similar, making very similar points that Hillary's style is one that's informed by her experience of operating in hostile terrain, of getting bounced as from the governorship of Arkansas after one term and then coming back and then dealing with the hostile terrain of a crazed Republican opposition during the 90s, that she's got this kind of siege mentality that the only way you can win anything is to hunker down, be super partisan, but be at the same time very, very cautious and lots of little micro initiatives, and then look, for getting progress an inch at a time. Whereas Obama has a completely different idea of just transcending partisan differences and transcending all kinds of differences, building up this sense of unity that then will make possible bolder and more transformative changes. Obama types look at Hillary stuff and see just some sort of dreary, soulless machinery, and Hillary partisans will look at Obama stuff and just see that it's airy-fairy naivete. So that seems to be the real difference, and maybe it's actually an important one. Maybe it's not just personal style.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I think this may be an area just from our correspondence beforehand where we have a little bit of disagreement. But my sense was that your concern was that what does it get you with Obama?
Right.
The guy talks a lot about unity and transcending partisan divisions and working across party lines. But ultimately, at the end of the day, he's just a liberal. And are we just basically going to see sort of Bushism in reverse, where the guy sort of governs from his base but tries to bring people in? In Obama's case, maybe more with a sort of velvet touch than a sort of brass knuckles touch that Bush and Rove had. But is it ultimately the same thing? I sensed a bit of that concern on your part. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, let me just a little background. I find a lot about Obama's campaign very, very appealing. Part of his liberalism I find appealing on foreign policy issues and on civil liberties issues. I think he represents the clearest break from the Bush years, and that's a break I'd like to see. On the domestic front, I think his policy positions seem to be fairly stereotypically left liberal in a way that leaves me a libertarian ice cold. But even so, the overall rhetoric of getting past the rancorous, bitter red versus blue polarization and to stop this politics of demonizing your opponent and thinking that in this pretty centrist, pretty incredibly stable country that we're in some kind of Armageddon against the other side. He promises to move politics in a direction that I think is much for the better. And I wrote a book that came out last year called The Age of Abundance, which is about political and cultural history of the United States since mass prosperity kicked in after World War II. And a lot of the story I tell is the emergence of this culture war between the new right and the sort of post-60s left. And in my concluding chapter, I make the case that both red and blue sides are campaigning for a kind of a half-truth. They've both got important things right and very serious things wrong. And so that substantively, this is an impasse. And that substantively, to move the country forward, we need to get past these half-truths and move on to a new kind of politics that recognizes the cultural dynamism that the 60s ushered in and also recognizes the economic dynamism that the 80s ushered in. Obama has got the music right, but he doesn't have the lyrics. And so, but it's a nice tune, and so I like it. But I fear not just that he will move policy in a direction I don't like, although I do fear that, but I fear also that if you preach a message of transpartisanship, not bipartisanship, not just incremental splitting of differences, but of enunciating a vision for the country that can unite a large majority of people across previous ideological lines. If you enunciate that kind of vision and marry it to a policy program that really doesn't take much from the other side at all, and again, not in terms of half loaves, but in terms of broad principles that will that can generate enthusiasm or support or be seen as an improvement over the status quo by large groups of the population across ideological lines, then it seems to me more like style and not so much substance, and I fear it will tarnish the style of transpartisan politics with just being salesmanship.
Well, I guess I'd say two things in response to that. One, I sort of wrote a bit about, and I think John Chait, my colleague who wrote one of the pieces you cited, mentioned. We kind of came at it from slightly different ways, but it was a similar point. And that is, if you go down kind of a number of domestic policy issues, Obama, supports, what you could describe as sort of the sort of standard liberal position. But it happens that about 60% of the public also supports the standard liberal position. If you look at minimum wage or healthcare or importing prescription drugs from other countries, there are a lot of domestic policy issues that unlike Bush, who was kind of trying to implement things where maybe only 40% or 45% of the public was in favor of, and just had to kind of pick off a couple of moderates from the other side. Yeah. Obama really does have this sort of broad majority of support for a lot of the things that he wants to do. So I think the theory is, if we're winning and inviting and cordial and welcoming to the other side, there are a lot of people who will just agree with us on the merits. Yep. And we don't have to ram things down their throat because we're right about these things, at least from in the eyes of public opinion. And my window onto this was when I was in Iowa before the caucuses, I spent a lot of time with an Obama precinct captain in a town called Ankeny. And Ankeny is a northern suburb of Des Moines, traditionally Republican, still has a lot of Republican leadership, political leadership. The state senator and state rep there is Republican, and it tends to lean Republican. But there are a lot of Republicans there who voted for Bush, but not out of any sort of strong ideological conviction, just as a kind of aversion to Democrats, really. Yeah. In the precinct captain I was with is a woman I sort of got to know well, and we're still in touch. Her name is Monica Green, longtime Republican, voted for Nixon, voted for Reagan, voted for Bush twice. And just kind of when I sort of probed and asked her what it was about Democrats she didn't like, or what it was about Bush she did like, well, she told me her vote was a vote against Gore and a vote against Kerry, not a vote for Bush. And I asked, well, what do you not like about Democrats? And I got the sense that she had this sort of stereotype in her mind that these were all sort of union hacks and kind of East Coast elitists, people who vacation on Martha's Vineyard and go windsurfing or whatever. Yeah. And that when she saw Obama, he sort of so shattered the molds that it kind of caught her attention. But then when I asked her substantively about policy, I said, well, what is it policy substantively that you like about Obama? And she said something like, well, and this is a very bright woman. I don't want to, she's not a rude by any stretch, very engaged. But she said, well, I really like his health care plan. I like the fact that he focuses on preventive care. And I sort of didn't have the heart to tell her that all of the Democrats have very similar health care plans. Right. They all focus on preventive care. But it was just this sort of, she had this sort of reflex against Democrats based on a sort of stereotype. And once Obama was able to shatter that stereotype, he was able to sort of bring people like her who kind of agreed with him substantively, but just hadn't been with Democrats before because they just didn't like them. They were spooked by them. They were creeped out by them. So I think Obama starts with that kind of fundamental advantage. And then the other thing I would say is sort of more broadly, but, you and I are probably ideologically relatively sympathetic. I'm by no means a libertarian, but I'm a moderate Democrat. Yep. Certainly sympathetic to free markets and trade, certainly socially pretty liberal. But I think, I don't think the majority in this country is where we are. Probably not where I am, but certainly not where you are. Right. I think, if you, Pew, the Pew Research Center, for example, I'm sure you've seen this, does this political typology every 5 or 6 years. Yes. And they kind of divide the country into 8 or 10 demographic groups. And if you look at each of those groups, you find that something like if you kind of add up the share of the electorate that each represents, you find that something like 60 to 70% of all voters, not just not just Democrats, are sympathetic to government spending or government intervention in the economy, somewhat skeptical of the free market, somewhat pro-regulation. I mean, obviously varies, by group, but there's a lot of sympathy for this stuff out there. And so I do think that Obama has a kind of natural majority that he could sort of tap into, and that just by changing things stylistically a bit, he would sort of allow this stuff to happen.
Well, this is a fairly long-running theory, or maybe you might call it a fantasy, that there is this latent liberal majority out there that somehow or another keeps getting its head turned by crazy diversions about gay marriage or guns, or just being turned off by the personally unappealing qualities of a Dukakis or a Gore or a Kerry, and that if you just get the right messenger, that the message will carry the day. I'll believe it when I see it. I know that there are big poll numbers out there in favor of kind of Democratic Party approaches to a variety of public policy issues. I know just as well, though, that the polls showed overwhelming support for Social Security privatization, and yet when it got thrown into the partisan grinder, it was destroyed. And so I guarantee you that if there's if healthcare comes up and there's a major reform initiative that's put in Congress, it's going to be bloody, and all of the interest groups and all the ideological groups are going to be fully engaged. And so unless substantively Obama can come forward with some sort of program that outflanks these deeply entrenched ideological and interest group forces, I feel like that his promise of transpartisanship is unlikely to be fully realized or even close to fully realized. That's my worry.
Well, this in some ways may be not a bad segue to Edwards and Huckabee, because my feeling about one of the problems with the way this majority is actually sort of constituted, or one reason why you don't see it sort of actualized, is because of the way these people are distributed across political parties.
Yeah.
And, if you look at that Pew typology again, you see that it's kind of 2/3 of the Democratic base and sort of half of the Republican base sort of is kind of, sympathetic to government intervention and government spending and more skeptical of business. But the problem is sort of elites in both parties and a lot of people who give money and fund campaigns take the opposite view, particularly on the Republican side, but even, on the Democratic side. I mean, you have a lot of people, affluent people, a lot of Democratic money now comes from Silicon Valley, say, and, and venture capitalists generally, and hedge fund hedge fund and private equity.
A lot from Wall Street,
Yeah, and, these are people who are socially liberal, and they believe that the free market works, except maybe when they want a certain subsidy from the federal government, but that's another story. But they by and large believe the free market is good for everyone else, if not themselves. And and they tend to be influential with the candidates that they fund. So I think one of the reasons that you don't see this sort of this kind of more big government statist majority kind of rising up and asserting itself is because of the two-party system and the way they're distributed across parties.
Yeah. Well, just first a point about the way in which the Democratic Party gets pulled away by its money donors. About a year or so ago, I wrote a piece for your magazine called Liberaltarians, where I made this argument that liberals and libertarians had more in common than they used to, given what's going on with conservatism, and that perhaps some kind of synthesis of liberal and libertarian views could be something that would be a public philosophy that would be transpartisan, that is, getting past the red versus blue divide. On behalf of the magazine, John Scheiber wrote a reply that basically told me to go jump off a bridge. But whether liberal intellectuals and commentators want to make common cause with libertarian ones or not is to some extent beside the point, because the fact is, given what's going on with conservatism and given what's happened with the Bush years, a lot of upper-income, well-educated, socially liberal, economically conservative types have drifted away from the Republican Party and into the Democratic Party. So there is this very influential libertarian group now, constituency within the Democratic Party. So we're coming whether you want us or not. And
I think that's exactly right. I think in a kind of perverse way, the Bush administration has sort of suppressed that. Or at least obscured it, I guess, because you see a lot of affluent kind of libertarian types who call themselves liberals now, but it's mostly because they're anti-Bush. So if Bush is for something, they're against it, they're against the war, and they're certainly socially very liberal. But you don't see them sort of kind of flexing their muscles on economic policy, just because the whole party is sort of focused on opposing Bush now. But I think you're right. If the Democrats win, you will see this very pronounced, libertarian, if we can borrow your term, group that is going to be incredibly influential, and I think just really should kind of chart the direction of the party. So I think that's exactly right. As someone who tilts Democratic, it actually frightens me quite a bit because I don't think those people are a majority in this country. So that's my kind of instinctive queasiness. If we take the sort of 40% of the country that's kind of libertarian, socially liberal, more sympathetic to kind of slightly smaller but still kind of effective government. The other guys will take the kind of more socially conservative statist group, and in that group, that 60% is going to beat going to beat Democrats every time.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly plausible, right? That if you just tally up the numbers, the socially liberal conservative, socially liberal, economically conservative group is a minority of people in the country, and so it feels like, just in a simplistic head counting kind of way, that the populist part of the spectrum, socially conservative, economically liberal, economically statist, that's where all the votes are, and therefore, if somebody ran a campaign appealing directly to those folks, that they should run away with the prize, and yet they never do, and we just saw that in this cycle with the two candidates that were, most appealing to sort of white working class resentment. Huckabee and Edwards in the respective parties, they've gone down in flames, and it's happened again and again. That candidates that try to run a kind of people against the powerful, to use a losing campaign slogan from 2000. Mantra of battling against the corporate greed and battling against Walmart and outsourcing and elites. They don't seem to be able to appeal to that majority that you would think on paper they would appeal to.
Well, I guess I'd say a couple of things in response. One, I think it's helpful to differentiate between primaries and the general. Right. I think in the primaries, the sort of the structure of the parties that we sort of talked about earlier it looms very large here. I think Mike Huckabee has a message that clearly appeals to a good chunk of Republicans. I mean, obviously not enough to get on the nomination, but a chunk, or maybe in theory enough, but in practice not. But attacking the Wall Street Washington axis in the Republican Party as currently constituted is just never going to get you anywhere because the money men are the Washington Wall Street axis, and they resent you attacking them. So it's very, very difficult as they're in the Republican Party as currently constituted to win on that kind of message, even if it's one that has some popular support, which I think his clearly did. There's no question. I mean, even if you look at just the Florida exit polls last night, McCain, who voted against the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, has now kind of tried to get on the other side of that issue. But I think most people think the guy's somewhat skeptical of kind of supply side economics. Yeah. You look at McCain, who did very well among middle class people on down the spectrum, and Huckabee, who also did very well. Those two people constituted about 50% of the vote in Florida last night. So I don't think it's the case that there's no traction.
But McCain didn't give him an inch on economic grounds. I mean, he's a deficit hawk who's telling them their jobs are going away and not coming back, and he's not catering to a Republican-leaning white working class resentment of immigrants. He doesn't have a populist message at all, and yet he's appealing to those people that supposedly are the constituency for that message.
Well, I think there's an element of populism. I certainly agree with you on immigration. I think part of sort of he does sort of run against Washington a bit. He does kind of rail about earmarks, which I think has some. I mean, you can see it as a sort of deficit hawk position, but it's also sort of these kind of fat cat lobbyists in the dead of night insert these, this corporate welfare into your legislation. I mean, he talks a lot about, for example, this Boeing jetliner that was kind of an inside deal that he put the kibosh on. And every time he talks about it, the price goes up. He used to say it was $2 billion and now it's $6 billion. But basically, I stop these corporate fat cats from pulling the wool over your eyes. So I do think there's an element of sort of populism to his message. It's clearly not the guy's not a Mike Huckabee or a John Edwards, but there's sort of a sheen that I think is still appealing to some middle and working class.
Yeah, I mean, of course you have to do that. Of course your message has to reach out to real people and connect with them in some way.
Yeah.
And just a purely elitist kind of wonky campaign is just doomed. So you've got to make it seem like that it connects with ordinary working folks.
Right.
But I think the lesson is that there are ways to do that, and while still preserving economically, market-friendly substance.
Right.
And McCain shows that. And then on the other side, on the Democratic Party, where there's supposedly a hunger for slash and burn partisanship to fight back against Bush, the slash and burn guy, Edwards, didn't take off.
It's true, though. I think Edwards, may have been a flawed messenger for a number of reasons. One of them being that he voted very differently when he was in the Senate.
He strikes me as kind of the Romney counterpart.
He was problematic.
The base candidate.
Yeah, I think the irony is part of it was actually sincere. That's how he really feels. And when he was in the Senate, his advisors just thought that that's how you had to go to be a compelling candidate in 2004.
Yeah.
So I think the guy's a trial lawyer, fought a lot against corporations. An aide of his once told me that there's no group of people he hates more than insurance companies, because these are the people he constantly battled with in court for 20 years in North Carolina. So I think some of it was authentic. The guy just got caught, changing his identity one too many times, I think. And the other thing is, the guy actually did inject some of these policy issues into the debate. If you look at Hillary and Obama, there were universal health care, relatively universal in Obama's case. Those are, Edwards was the first guy to come out with a plan on health care. He was the first guy to kind of introduce skepticism of trade agreements into the Democratic debate, which these other two guys subsequently adopted. So his legacy will sort of outlive his own political ambitions, I think, in tilting the field a little bit to the left.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why a more economically populist substance is popular with Democrats right now, and so we certainly see that in the substance of the platforms for both Clinton and Obama. They're to the left of prior Democratic candidates in the last couple of cycles, but still, I think it is significant that in this era of the inflamed netroots and that blue state polarization kind of fizzled. That you've got, on the one hand, the two finalists are a centrist, technocratic managerialist and a very non-confrontational unifier who likes to blur ideological and partisan distinctions.
Though, as you said yourself, Obama is very unifying stylistically, but substantively, he is kind of a liberal. I think you can't dismiss the substantive part of what he would do. It would be substantively, certainly more statist than a lot of candidates in recent.
No, that's right. The question is, I think, for Obama, assuming he became president, what happens when his style conflicts with the substance? That is, when it becomes clear that there is entrenched and immovable opposition that would require Clinton-style political warfare to move even a few inches. What does he do? Does he hang on to his unifying message and find something that finesses the difference, or does he throw that overboard and fight? And so that's. We'll find out in 2009 or 2010. But right now we've been going on for a little bit over an hour, so I think it's time for us to sign off. But it was great chatting with you, and
likewise.
I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Likewise, yeah, I enjoyed it quite a bit.
All right, Noam.
All right, take care.
Take care.